King George, what was his problem? The whole hilarious story of the American Revolution by Steve Sheinkin, illustrated by Tim Robinson. How to start a revolution. Entire books have been written about the causes of the American Revolution. You'll be glad to know this isn't one of them. But you should really understand how the whole thing got started. After all, if you ever find yourself ruled by someone like King George, you'll want to know what to do. So here is a summary of a quick step-by-step guide to starting a revolution. Step 1. Kick out the French. Let's pick up the action in 1750. Britain, France, and Spain had carved up North America into massive empires, as you can see on the map. You'd think they'd be satisfied, right? But Britain and France both wanted to see their name on even more of the map. Let's face it, they both wanted the whole map. It didn't bother them that most of the land actually belonged to Native Americans. To Britain and France, this seemed like a good reason to fight a war. You can call it the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. Either way, the British won. Britain took over most of France's land in North America. For Britain, this was the good news. Step 2. Tax the colonists. Here's the bad news. War is really expensive. The British were left with a mountain of debt, and now they had to pay to keep 10,000 soldiers in North America to protect all their new land. That's not cheap. The British Prime Minister, George Grenville, started thinking of ways to raise some quick cash. You can guess the idea he came up with, can't you? That's right, he decided to tax the British colonists. Grenville's plan was called the Stamp Act. When colonists signed any legal document or bought paper goods like newspapers, books, or even playing cards, they would have to buy stamps too. The stamps showed that you paid the tax. Parliament warned that the Stamp Act might spark protests in the colonies, but young King George III liked the ideas. He didn't expect any problems. Step 3. Hang the taxman. King George never did understand Americans. No one likes a tax increase, no matter the reasons. Besides, the 13 colonies had been pretty much governing themselves for years, and self-government obviously includes coming up with your own taxes. So the colonists started shouting the slogan, "No taxation without representation," meaning basically, we're not paying. Shouting is easy, but how do you actually avoid paying the tax? Samuel Adams of Boston had that figured out. He figured it like this. The Stamp Act is supposed to go into effect in November 1765, right? Well, what if there's no one around to distribute the stamps? Then we won't have to buy them. Simple. The job of distributing stamps in Boston belonged to a man named Andrew Oliver. When Oliver woke up one morning in August, he was informed that a full-sized Andrew Oliver doll was hanging from an elm tree in town. Pinned to the doll was a nice poem. What greater joy did New England see than a stamp man hanging on a tree? It got worse. That night, a crowd of Bostonians yelling about taxes cut the doll down and carried it to Oliver's house. They chopped off its head and set it on fire. Then they started breaking Oliver's windows. As you can imagine, Andrew Oliver found the whole experience fairly frightening. He wasn't so eager to start giving out stamps in Boston. That's exactly how Adams had planned it. Similar scenes took place all over the 13 colonies. Calling themselves Sons of Liberty, protesters gave plenty of Stamp Act agents the Andrew Oliver treatment. The agents quit as fast as they could. Can you blame them? So when the tax went into effect, there was no one around to collect it. Step 4. Try again. Back in London, the British government was forced to face a painful fact. There was no money in this Stamp Act deal. Parliament voted to repeal or get rid of the tax. King George reluctantly approved this decision. Colonists celebrated the news with feasts and dances. The happy people of New York City built a statue of King George and put it in a city park. What the colonists didn't realize was that the British leaders were already talking about new taxes. After all, the British government still needed money, and most of the leaders still insisted that Britain had every right to tax the Americans. King George was especially firm on this point. He was a very stubborn fellow. So Parliament passed the Townshend Acts in 1767. When colonial merchants imported stuff like paper, paint, glass, and tea, they now had to pay a tax based on the value of each item. Or would they? Step 5. Refuse to pay. Rather than pay the new taxes, colonists started boycotting or refusing to buy British imports. Women were the driving force behind these boycotts. John Hancock found another way to get around paying taxes. He simply snuck his goods past the tax collectors. He knew that smuggling was illegal, but he didn't feel too guilty about it. To Hancock, smuggling seemed like a fair response to an unfair law. Of course, the British wanted to stop smugglers like Hancock, but you have to remember, colonists really hated these taxes. So any British official who tried too hard to collect taxes was taking a serious risk. Think of poor John Malcolm, for example. This British official was stripped to the waist, smeared with hot tar, and covered with feathers from a pillow. Then he was pulled through Boston in a cart just to make the humiliation complete. What was the worst thing about getting tarred and feathered? Malcolm said the most painful part was trying to rip the tar off his burned body. He mailed a box of his tar and feathers, with bits of his skin still attached, to the British government in London. They sympathized. They sent him money. By spring of 1768, the Sons of Liberty were gathered together and threw stones at tax collectors' houses. They even dragged a tax agent's boat out of the water and lit it on fire. The terrified taxman escaped to an island in the Boston harbor. Step 6. Send in the warships. King George did not appreciate this form of protest. The world's most powerful country can't have its government employees hiding on an island. That doesn't look good. It was time to get tough with the colonists. In the words of Frederick North, one of the king's favorite advisors, America must fear you before she can love you. The point is simple. The British soldiers and the people of Boston just weren't getting along, and it's easy to see why. The soldiers were in town to force laws that made people furious, and people took their anger out on the soldiers. Did the soldiers deserve such hatred? Maybe not. Most were 17 and 18-year-old boys from poor families. This was the only job they could get, and they hated being in Boston just as much as the people hated having them. On the night of March 5th, 1770, all anger in Boston exploded into violence. Step 7. Fire into a crowd. It was a cold night. There was a foot of snow on the ground. Sons of Liberty walked the streets in groups, wooden clubs in hand. They watched the soldiers, and the soldiers watched them. Both sides were expecting something to happen. But no one thought it would begin with an apprentice wig maker named Edward Garrick. At about 8:30, young Garrick passed a British officer in the street. Garrick pointed to the officer and shouted, "There goes the fellow that won't pay my master for dressing his hair." That's a serious insult. He was accusing a gentleman of not paying his debts. A young British soldier stepped forward to defend his officer. They all exchanged curses. Then the soldier cracked Garrick in the head with the butt of his musket. Garrick went down, scrambled up, and yelled for help. A crowd quickly gathered. First, it was just a few of Garrick's friends. Then people started coming from all over town. 8 soldiers pushed their way through the mob. About 300 people surrounded the soldiers, cursing at them and pelting them with snowballs, chunks of ice, even oyster shells. The soldiers pointed their loaded guns. The crowd shoved closer and closer to the blades of the British bayonets, shouting, "You dare not fire! You can't kill us all!" Then there was a shot. Then a lot of shots. Then smoke and shocked silence. The crowd backed away. 7 of the men had been shot. 4 of them later died. At a town meeting the next morning, Samuel Adams charged British soldiers with firing into a crowd of harmless protesters. As we've seen, this was not exactly true. Samuel was a gifted storyteller. He called the soldiers bloody murderers and gave the incident a name everyone would remember: the Boston Massacre. Step 8. Keep the tea tax. After the massacre, General Gage pulled the British soldiers out of Boston. This helped calm things down. Over in Britain, leaders saw that the Townshend Act were much more trouble than they were worth. Parliament voted to repeal the taxes. Well, most of them. They kept the tax on tea. This was done on very specific instructions from King George. The king knew the small tea tax would not bring in any real money. He just wanted everyone to know that Britain still had the power to tax the colonies. Told you he was stubborn. Step 9. Throw a tea party. On the night of December 16, 1773, a Boston shoemaker named George Hughes went to a blacksmith shop and smeared coal dust on his face. He was hoping it would look like the war paint of a Mohawk Indian. It didn't, but that was okay. The main idea was to be in disguise. Hughes went out into the dark street with an axe in his hand. Dozens of men, all badly disguised as Indians, were marching down to the waterfront. 3 ships of British tea were tied up in the wharf in the Boston harbor. The people of Boston had refused to let the ship owners unload the cargo. They had no intention of paying the tea tax. So the tea sat in the ships, neatly packed in chests, but not for long. George Hughes and other disguised Sons of Liberty rowed out to the British ships. Communicating with only grunts and silent signals, about 50 men boarded each ship. They dragged the chests of tea to the deck, chopped them open with axes, and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. Step 10. Pay the fiddler. A British naval commander named Admiral Montague watched the Boston Tea Party from the window of his waterfront house. As the disguised Sons of Liberty marched away from the wharf, Montague opened his window and exchanged shouts with some of the men, reminding them they'd have to pay the fiddler. In other words, they would have to face the consequences of their actions. One consequence was that King George threw an absolute fit. He called the Tea Party violent and outrageous, and he wasn't alone. Even members of Parliament who usually supported the Americans were furious about the destruction of British tea. At the King's request, Parliament passed a series of laws designed to teach the people of Boston once and for all that British authority must be obeyed. No fooling around now. Parliament ordered the port of Boston shut down until the town paid for the ruined tea. People of Massachusetts would no longer be allowed to elect their own judges or sheriffs, and if the residents of Boston wanted to hold a town meeting, they would need permission from British officials. To enforce all of this, General Thomas Gage was sent back to Boston, this time with 4,000 British soldiers. That should solve everything, right? Step 11. Stand firm. As planned, the British soldiers had closed the port of Boston. This was a kick in the gut to the Boston economy, which was built on shipping and trade. Stores shut, jobs disappeared, Colonists called the harsh British punishments the intolerable acts. Even people who avoided politics took sides in the crisis. You were a patriot if you opposed British taxes and stood by Boston. You were a loyalist if you supported the king. Patriots all over the colonies sent supplies to Boston: beef, fish, flour, rice, cash. Patriot leaders also agreed to hold a meeting in Philadelphia. They would all get to know each other, maybe figure out what to do about the intolerable acts. Sam Adams would be making the trip to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress. He set off for Congress in a fancy new suit with gold buttons on the sleeve. Next to him in the carriage sat his cousin John Adams, well-known lawyer, patriot, and grump. A few hundred miles south in Virginia, George Washington was also getting ready for Congress. Washington was one of the few patriot leaders with military experience from the French and Indian War. And he had recently made news with a bold promise. If need be, I will raise 1,000 men, supply them at my own expense, and march myself at their head for the relief of Boston. Patrick Henry and Edmund Pendleton, two more Virginian patriots, stopped by Washington's place, and they all set out together for Philadelphia. Step 12. Make speeches. The Continental Congress began in Philadelphia in early September 1774. There were a total of 56 delegates from 12 colonies. Georgia stayed home. 56 men meant 56 different opinions and some very long debates. So it took a while, but the members of Congress came to some serious decisions. They declared the intolerable acts to be illegal violation of the rights of American colonists. They decided it was time to start boycotting trade with Britain again, and they agreed that the colonies should start arming and training their militias, volunteer armies, just in case there was trouble with the British soldiers in Boston. Before the Congress ended, Patrick Henry did two things he was famous for. One, he annoyed everyone by talking too much, and two, he made a few fabulous speeches. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more, he cried. I am not a Virginian, but an American. This kind of unity really surprised British leaders. They had been sure the other colonies would stand aside and let Massachusetts suffer alone. Step 13. Let blows decide. Now the stage was set for a showdown. Neither side really wanted war, but neither side was willing to back down. As usual, King George thought a show of force would improve matters. He declared, "The New England colonies are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject of this country or independent." Blows, you say? Speaking in a church in Virginia, Patrick Henry did his thing. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Back in Boston, all this tough talk was making General Gage extremely nervous. Unlike Patrick Henry and King George, Gage was actually going to have to do the fighting. He wrote to London asking for more soldiers. If you think 10,000 men sufficient, send 20, Gage wrote. And this takes us up to April 1775, right where we want to be.